Welcome back. This is the combined version of Chapter 5 and 6. So we've already talked about Chapter 3, and in Chapter 3 it was divided up into 2 lectures, and we talked about organization specifically, and energy flow and those feeding relationships like food chains and food webs. In Chapter 4 there was 1 lecture, and we talked about biomes, abiotic and biotic factors. And we also talked about those symbiotic relationships and what symbiosis really is and how it benefits organisms. This is, like I said, Chapter 5 and 6, and so we're going to start by talking about population growth. We're also going to talk about what are some factors that limit population growth, which are called limiting factors. So let's just get into what population growth is all about. And the first thing we need to talk about when we talk about population growth is this idea of immigration and emigration. So immigration with an I, okay, and I say I because remember there's 2 forms of immigration. Immigration that starts with I is the movement of individuals into an area. So immigration with an I into, these are animals that are coming into an area. So they are immigrating into, and we call them immigrants. So animals in search of mates or food arrive, and arrive is keyword, from outside of the area. So they're coming into our area. If you contrast that with emigration, the movement of individuals out of an area, and if you think E and you think exit, then it makes sense. Okay? So young animals approaching maturity leave the area where they were born, find mates, and establish new territories. They're going to grow up in one area, leave the nest, so to speak, and then go out to the world in search of new mates and new resources. A shortage of food in one area may also lead to immigration because organisms at this point need to leave. Okay, so if we have population number 1 and we have population number 2. Population number 1 has a pretty healthy population of individuals. Notice we even get into allele frequencies or the allele distribution in this image. So we've got organisms that are brown and organisms that are white. The organisms that are white are little a, so bringing in some genetics. Organisms that are brown are either big A, little a, or big A in this case. Okay, so obviously the brown color is the dominant color and the white color is the recessive color. And so when an organism leaves this island or leaves this location, it is going to be it's going to immigrate out, and it's going to immigrate into population number 2. Notice that over here there is no recessive, there are no recessive alleles, and so this goose or duck would bring in a pair of recessive alleles and then ultimately would probably form some heterozygosity in this population. Okay, so not only is this showing you immigration and immigration, it's also showing you how gene pools change, how allele frequencies can change, which gets into evolution. Okay, so when a population is growing, it can grow in 2 different ways. This is exponential. Okay, exponential is when it grows faster and faster and faster and faster, almost like if you were to look at bacteria doubling times or bacteria population, it would grow in this exponential rate. Okay, when individuals in a population reproduce at a constant rate, it is exponential growth. Why is constant rate not like this, more of a linear fashion? Because we start with 1 and 1 makes 2, 2 makes 4, 4 makes 8, 8 makes 16, 16 makes 32, okay, and so on. So you can see that if the population is reproducing at the same rate or constant rate, it's going to double because the population size is getting bigger. And so every time the population reproduces, it's going to grow or double, I should say. This would be more of a linear function, and that would not be at a constant rate, but would probably be more, probably be a healthier growth. But again, you don't need to know anything like that. We just need to know that if it's growing at a constant rate, it's going to be growing exponentially. Can a population grow exponentially forever? No. Okay, it's going to reach a eventually threshold, and that threshold is called the carrying capacity. Okay, carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the maximum number of organisms a certain ecosystem or a certain environment can support. And what are the things that go into this carrying capacity? It's the amount of resources, it's the amount of space, It's the amount of oxygen, it's the amount of food, it's all of these things play into where this carrying capacity can be. And this carrying capacity is kind of a fluid, or it's kind of in a constant state of flux. The carrying capacity can move up slightly, and it can also move down slightly depending on the amount of resources. Okay? If the resources drop because of a drought, then the carrying capacity of that organism, of the carrying capacity of that island, or carrying capacity of that environment is going to drop. Okay? Because there are no resources at that point. If resources become more abundant, and for some reason the environment opens up to more space, then the carrying capacity might actually increase. But carrying capacity is the maximum amount of organisms that environment can support. Okay? So when we look at logistic growth and we look at exponential growth, we're always going to start with a lag phase. The lag phase is number 1. Okay? Lag phase is going to be basically the slowest growth phase. It's kind of like lagging along, and then all of a sudden you're going to experience the exponential growth phase, number 2. So it's going to lag, and all of a sudden the population is going to take off, and it's going to grow at an exponential rate. If you look at this curve right here, that is your exponential growth. 3 is your deceleration phase, which means we're growing exponentially, and then all of a sudden we are sensing, and I say we, the organism is sensing it becoming close to the carrying capacity. Now, this isn't a conscious thought. It's just that the struggle for existence probably becomes greater because there are more and more organisms that are using up more and more of the resources, and if there's only a set number or a set amount of resources, then it's going to be harder for every one of those organisms to acquire the resources it needs. And so it starts decelerating or slowing down. So the growth, if you were to look at a slope, the slope is the greatest right here, okay, but actually starts slowing down as you move this way, okay, and then eventually it gets to here and slope's pretty much 0. Now, you always overshoot the carrying capacity. Typically will overshoot. So all of a sudden organisms are slowing down, but they still have resources. They're still reproducing. They still have resources, still reproducing, and all of a sudden all the organisms that were just produced by sexual reproduction are in the environment, and all of a sudden now they no longer have resources, okay? And so if you overshoot the carrying capacity, now there isn't enough resources for the organisms, and so they die out. And when they die out, they drop below the carrying capacity, but now all of a sudden they do have resources available, and so they reproduce and they overshoot the carrying capacity again. Oh, and then there's no resources, so they die out, and then there are resources, and then they die, reproduce, and then there's no resources, then there are resources, and then there's no resources, and so they sit there and they overshoot and then die off, overshoot, die off, overshoot, die off. But for the most part, the population stays very stable at that carrying capacity. Okay? This is called the 4th phase, which is the stable equilibrium phase, and they're staying stable population-wise. Now, it does grow and then die, grow, die, grow, die, but for the most part, the population stays relatively stable right there at the carrying capacity. Okay? We call this an S-shaped curve, and the S-shaped curve comes from this, basically, right there, that shape, okay? It kind of looks like an S. Now, it's a really weird-looking S, but it looks like an S. Okay, so what is the carrying capacity? We already talked about it a little bit, but the carrying capacity is the point at which the line intersects the y-axis, and it tells you the size of the population when the average growth rate reaches 0. Remember, I said the slope was 0 at that point, but it's the maximum amount of organisms an environment can support. Okay, and again, it depends on the amount of resources and the amount of space in that environment. Okay, it represents the largest number of individuals that a given environment can support. Really important. An organism can't grow forever, population-wise, and an environment can't support an infinite number of individuals. So what determines population size? Okay, we call these limiting factors. Within the limiting factors, there are 2 kind of subcategories. You have density-dependent factors and density-independent factors. Now, I color-coded them to make them easier to identify. Density-dependent factors, just like the dependent variable in a scientific method, a density-dependent factor is a factor that depends on density. Okay? Depends on density. Density independent factor is a factor that is completely independent of density. So these are things that don't directly depend on density. Density dependent factors are things like competition. Competition among organisms and over resources is going to be dependent on the density of those organisms within the environment. Predation is going to directly depend on how many organisms there are in a particular environment. Parasitism and disease are factors that are directly dependent on the amount of organisms in that environment. And then we switch gears and change colors. Density independent factors are independent of density. Drought is going to happen regardless of the number of organisms in that environment. Climate extremes like other natural resources or natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, all kinds of those things, avalanche, all of those natural disasters are going to happen whether you have one organism or a million organisms in that environment. Okay, those are just weather and climate extremes. Human disturbances are going to happen regardless of the number of density or the number of organisms within an environment. So you have these things in red, which are directly dependent on density, and then you have these in blue, which are basically completely independent of density. Okay, density dependent factors become limiting only when the population density reaches a certain level, and like I said, we start getting closer to that carrying capacity. It really, I mean, just think of density in terms of humans and various cities. Okay, the more dense a particular city or environment is, the harder it is to do anything or go anywhere or reach any specific resource you may need. Okay, operate most strongly when a population is large and dense, and so when populations are large and dense, competition is the highest, and when populations are large and dense, predation is the highest, and when populations are large and dense, parasitism and disease is the highest. Okay, it's really hard to pass on diseases if there's only 2 organisms in 100 square miles, because the chances of them coming together or in contact with each other is very small. Okay, but if you had 100 organisms in a 1 square mile, then competition for the resources within that square mile is going to be very high. Okay, density independent factors affect all populations in similar ways regardless of the population size. And so, like I said, natural disasters and unusual weather is going to happen regardless of how many zebras there are on this particular plane, or how many earthworms there are in this square meter. So weather patterns and natural disasters are going to happen. They're not going to affect larger populations greater than they're going to affect smaller populations. Okay, seasonal cycles, it's still going to turn summer, fall, winter, spring, regardless of the number of organisms in a particular area. And then human activities are going to happen regardless of population size also. So if we look at predator-prey relationships, this is the most iconic kind of predator-prey relationship you'll ever probably study in biology. And if we look at or follow the population growth of a snowshoe hare population and a lynx population, you get a graph that looks like this. Now this is a double axis graph, and so we have thousands of hares on this side, and we have thousands of lynx on this side. Notice that the scale is different, so obviously we have more hares at a particular time than we have lynx, which makes sense because if we think of our energy flow and our numbers or energy pyramids, we have to have a greater amount of prey than we have of predators, or the population isn't going to work out. So if we look at blue, which is the snowshoe hare, anytime the hare population increases, the lynx population grows with it. And then anytime the lynx population grows or the predator population grows, then all of a sudden the prey drops. And then as soon as the prey drops, the predator drops. And then when the predator drops, the prey increases. And when the prey increases, the predator increases. Okay? And then you follow that same pattern all the way through the years. And so if we go from 1850 to ultimately 1950 and then to 2000, we can look at the cycling of these populations over the course of the last 200 years. Okay. The important part to note here is that when prey increases, predators can increase too, because now there's more resources for the predators. But when predators increase, they eat more, and so they drop the prey population. But when they drop the prey population, all of a sudden now there's greater amount of predators than there are of prey items, and so the predators have to fall as well. So there is a limiting factor, okay, in population size, because we're talking about predation. Okay, it's going to limit the density of these organisms in their environment. Now, if we look more at human growth in these cases, but all populations, regardless of species, is going to follow the same pattern. But when birth rate exceeds the death rate, then the population is growing, and that makes sense. When more babies are being born, then people are dying, then the population is growing. Now, we have different types of growth in populations or in kind of rapidly growing countries that maybe aren't as developed. Okay, in the more non-developed countries like Kenya, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, population is growing very rapidly, and you can see that's more of an exponential growth, right? There's a lot of babies being born both on the male and female side. Okay, notice that the male side is on the left, female side is on the right, and if we had an axis over here, we would have different age categories. So we would have like 0 to 5 years, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 20, and so you notice that as the population, or as we increase on this graph, the population of each category gets smaller, and that's because people are dying and dying, and people aren't living as long. There isn't as many people at this age as there are at this age, and it makes sense. These blue years would be ages 0 to 14. The yellow would be basically your reproductive years, which is ages 15 to 44. And then everything above that in kind of this orangey red color is ages 45 to 85. Now, if you look at slow growth, it's more of a straight line pyramid. This is more of kind of a curved line pyramid. This is growing very fast. This is growing very slow. Notice it's still growing because our bars are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, but it's growing at a more controllable rate. Also, this population, people are growing to be older than in this population. They're dying earlier on average. Okay, you can see how much higher it is. That would be that would be countries like Canada, United States, Australia, a lot of the European countries that are still growing. And then you have zero growth. It's more of just a straight tube. Okay, it's not flaring at all. That would be countries like Denmark, Austria, Italy. And then negative growth, like Germany, is actually, they have greater population of people up here, and it's actually tailing in because they're not having babies, and the babies aren't replacing the people above them. So they're actually experiencing negative growth. So they are declining in population size. So that's it for population growth. Now we just need to get into a little bit of pollution and how that affects specific populations, and we're pretty much done. So smog, you've probably heard smog. Smog is a mixture of chemicals that occurs as a gray-brown haze in the atmosphere. A lot of times in the big cities, especially like Mexico City or in China, Japan, a lot of those places, they have a lot bigger smog issue than we do in the world or the U.S. But it's just kind of a gray-brown haze that is a mixture of chemicals in the atmosphere. Pollutant is any harmful material that can alter the biosphere through the land, air, or water. Pollutants are things that can be leached into water supplies from plants or factories. They could also be leached into land. They also could be leached into the air. Okay? Acid rain. So when we burn fossil fuels, it's called combustion. The burning of those fossil fuels are going to release nitrogen and sulfur compounds into the atmosphere that are going to combine with water when water is basically condensing in the air to form rain. And when these nitrogen and sulfur compounds basically combine with raindrops, they form nitric and sulfuric acids, which are going to obviously rain down onto environments and turn it very acidic. So here's a quick little I guess diagram that's going to show the acid rain formation and also the effects. So we have a factory. Okay, maybe this is an electrical power plant. We're burning fossil fuels to produce electricity, and as we combust those fossil fuels, we're going to release NOx and SOx, I like to say, okay, or nitric oxide compounds and sulfuric oxide compounds. These compounds are going to basically mix with the water droplets that are in the atmosphere as basically condensed rain or condensed water vapor. When these NOx and SOx are going to bond with our raindrops, they're going to rain back down onto our environment as the form of sulfuric and nitric acid. It's going to have large effects on our environment because it's going to turn our water supplies acidic. It's also going to turn our soils acidic, and certain plants and fish life and land-based life are not going to be able to grow in an acidic environment. And so if the plants don't grow, then the producers are basically not there, and none of the environment are going to be conducive to really supporting life. Okay, so how does that impact biodiversity? Biodiversity is the sum total of the genetic-based variety of all organisms in the atmosphere, okay, or the biosphere, I should say. Remember, biosphere is the place on Earth where life exists, and the more pollution and the more acid rain we put on our environment, the less biodiversity we're going to have, which means it's negatively going to impact the food chains and energy flow in our environment. Okay. Another big threat to biodiversity, and I know everybody probably knows, is human activity. Okay, human activity can reduce biodiversity by altering habitats, hunting species to extinction, and introducing toxic compounds into food webs, and introducing foreign species into new environments. So, altering habitats, that could be things like deforestation so that we produce not only residential areas but also new city areas. Hunting species to extinction, that could be things like ivory, the whole ivory black market trade. Introducing toxic compounds is obviously pollution. The more we grow into environments and the more we produce chemical-wise or energy-wise, we're going to introduce more and more toxic compounds into food webs. Introducing foreign species, that is invasive species, and that happens all the time. Okay. Those species could go extinct, and endangered species as well. Okay, biological magnification. So has everybody ever heard of the DDT, basically DDT problem we had with eagles in like the 50s? Eagles obviously eat fish, and this DDT was a pesticide that was used in the 50s and 60s and was basically produced to be the most effective insect killer at the time, and it worked really well. The problem was when farmers sprayed it on their fields, it leached from the fields into water supplies and then ultimately populated. Okay, even though the concentration was very low, it still got in the water supply. Producers obviously took in the water, and so it magnified up 1,000 times. Then the producers are eaten by zooplankton, and it's magnified. Zooplankton's eaten by small fish, it's magnified. Small fish get eaten by large fish, it's magnified. And then all of a sudden large fish get eaten by the birds, and it's magnified again. Why is it magnified? We're talking concentration. A little bit of something in the water can become very concentrated at the lower or at the higher food chains, trophic levels, just based on the way the concentrations of these chemicals work. Okay, concentrations of harmful substances increase in organisms at a higher trophic level in a food chain or a food web. Okay, every time multiple water molecules are taken in by the producers, it deposits more and more and more in the producer. When the zooplankton eat a bunch of producers, it's magnified into them. Small fish eat a bunch of zooplankton, so it's magnified. Okay, you're taking in a bunch of this per zooplankton you eat. Large fish are taking in a bunch of this per fish they eat, and they eat a bunch of small fish, And then, you know, fish eating birds, that's all they eat is fish. And so when you're constantly eating fish that have already a high level of DDT concentration, then you're just magnifying that in your concentration. Now, how does DDT affect birds if it is designed to be an insect repellent or an insect killer? It was causing these birds to produce really soft shells. And so when these mother eagles would lay their eggs and then sit on them, they were actually crushing their own eggs. And so if you're crushing your own eggs, you're not reproducing successfully, and the eagle population really declined. Okay. Ozone depletion. What happens when we use a lot of these chemicals? We deplete ozone, and 20 to 50 kilometers above Earth's surface in the atmosphere, we contain a relatively high concentrations of ozone naturally. Okay, you can see it up here. Here is a protective natural ozone layer over the top of our atmosphere. Okay, so you get an atmosphere, you get a stratosphere, you get the mesosphere, but between the stratosphere and the atmosphere, there's a protective natural ozone layer. This is like our sunscreen. The sunscreen is going to help filter out a lot of the UV that we obviously don't want to be exposed to. It absorbs a good deal of harmful ultraviolet radiation from sunlight before it reaches Earth's surface, which directly impacts the frequency in which we get sun cancer or skin cancer. Okay, but the ozone is depleting, okay, or becoming more scarce, and if the ozone layer is becoming more scarce or thinner, then more and more of the UV light will reach the Earth, which is going to increase the amount of skin cancer, or the prevalence of skin cancer. Also, the more light and UV get through, the higher our surface temperatures are going to be, and there are models that suggest by the year 2050, which really isn't that far away, the average or mean surface temp is going to increase by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. Now I know 1 to 2 degrees Celsius doesn't seem like that big of a jump, but a 1 to 2 degrees Celsius change can actually melt a lot of the polar ice caps, which are going to flood a lot of the coastal areas, because I think it's like 90% of the human civilization is living on or near the coast. And so if the sea levels rise because of all of this fresh water that is now locked in ice, once it melts, it's going to rise sea levels. And so a lot of those coastal areas, including islands, can actually flood and become, disappear. That is chapters 5 and 6. That's where we'll end it. All of the ecology content has been covered now. Make sure you bring your notes to class, and we will do a quick review before we take the test. See ya.